Hello, everyone. This is a story about how wool was turned into cloth before machines existed. Feel free to subscribe to my channel so you can hear from me again. Before we begin, just get comfortable. Pull your blanket a little closer. Take a slow breath. There is nothing you need to do right now. Just listen. Somewhere in the English countryside, a few hundred years ago, a woman woke up before sunrise. The fire in the hearth had burned low overnight. The room was dim and cool. She added a log, watched the flames pick back up, and then she sat down in her chair beside the window. On her lap, she placed a small bundle of wool, creamy white, soft and a little oily to the touch. She had been working with this same bundle for the past 3 days, and she would probably be working with it for 3 more. This was just Tuesday, or whatever they called it back then. The point is, it was a normal morning, nothing dramatic, just a woman, a chair, a fire, and a pile of wool that needed to become something useful. That is what this story is about. Before there were factories, before there were machines that could spin thread in seconds and weave cloth by the mile, every single piece of fabric in the world was made by hand, slowly, carefully, by ordinary people in ordinary homes, doing the same quiet work day after day. The shirt on your back, the sheets on your bed, the coat that kept someone warm through a cold winter 300 years ago, all of it started with a sheep. And between the sheep and the finished cloth, there was an enormous amount of patient, unhurried work. We are going to follow that process tonight, from the very beginning to the very end. We will start in the fields with the sheep themselves. We will move through shearing, washing, carding, spinning, dyeing, and weaving. We will end with the finished cloth, folded and sold, finding its way into someone's home. It is a slow story, a gentle one, the kind of work that does not rush because it cannot rush. And honestly, that is exactly the kind of story this is meant to be. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let us go back to a time when every thread meant something because someone had made it themselves. The fire is going. The window is gray with early morning light. There is a pile of wool on someone's lap, waiting. Let us begin. It all begins with the sheep. That sounds obvious, but it is worth pausing on for a moment, because the sheep is really doing an extraordinary amount of work here without being asked. Every year, a single sheep grows somewhere between 3 and 10 pounds of wool. It just grows it. The sheep does not have a plan. It is not trying to be helpful. It is simply going about its life, eating grass, wandering slowly across hillsides, occasionally looking confused. And yet, by the time spring comes around, it is wearing an entire year's worth of fibre, thick, warm, and ready to be removed. People figured this out a very long time ago. Sheep have been kept for their wool for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer. Early farmers in the Middle East noticed that certain wild sheep naturally shed their wool in spring, and that this wool could be gathered and used for warmth. From there, over thousands of years, people selectively bred sheep to produce more wool, softer wool, wool that did not shed on its own, but had to be cut. By the Middle Ages in England, sheep farming had become one of the most important industries in the entire country. England's wealth for several centuries was built almost entirely on the back of its sheep. There is a reason the Lord Chancellor in the Houses of Parliament still sits on something called the wool sack. It is literally a large bag stuffed with wool, a symbol of where England's fortune came from. The breeds of sheep varied depending on where you were. In the upland areas, the wool was coarser, better for heavy outer garments, blankets, working clothes. In the lowlands, some breeds produced finer, softer fleeces. These were more valuable, more carefully tended. A shepherd's life revolved around the flock, moving them between pastures, watching for illness, keeping them safe from foxes and wolves, though wolves were mostly gone from England by the later medieval period, making sure they had enough to eat through the winter. It was a quiet life, repetitive, long stretches of time outdoors in all weathers, watching animals that moved slowly and grazed peacefully and rarely did anything interesting. Some people find that idea exhausting, others find it quietly appealing. The sheep themselves were not particularly grateful. They never are. But they showed up every spring with their coat of wool intact, which was really all anyone needed from them. The grass is long and green, the sky is pale and wide. Somewhere on a hillside, a flock of sheep is moving slowly, and a shepherd is watching from a distance, and everything is very, very calm. Shearing day was one of the most important days of the farming year. It happened in late spring, usually May or June, once the worst of the cold was past, but before the heat of summer made the sheep uncomfortable under their heavy coats. The timing mattered. Too early, and a late frost could be dangerous for a newly shorn sheep. Too late, and the wool might start to felt on the animal's back, which made it harder to work with. The shearers arrived early in the morning. In small villages, shearing was often a communal event. Families would move from farm to farm, helping each other out. There would be food, there would be noise. Children ran around getting underfoot. Dogs were banished to a safe distance, and one by one the sheep were brought in, held firmly, and clipped. The shearer's job looked simple from a distance and was not simple at all up close. A good shearer could work quickly and smoothly, removing the fleece in one continuous piece, like peeling an orange in a way, except the orange weighs 80 pounds and has opinions about the whole process. The goal was to keep the fleece intact, one whole piece rolled together. This was called a staple, and the quality of the staple affected how easy it would be to work with later. A bad cut, going back over the same spot twice, produced what spinners called second cuts. Short little pieces of fiber that did not spin well, got tangled in everything, and generally caused problems later. Experienced shearers avoided this. Inexperienced ones created a lot of extra work for someone else down the line. Once a sheep was shorn, it stood up, shook itself, and walked away looking vaguely offended, lighter, cooler, and considerably less fluffy than it had been 5 minutes ago. The fleeces were rolled up and set aside. They were greasy with lanolin, the natural oil the sheep's skin produces, which is actually very good for human hands incidentally. Wool workers often had remarkably soft hands for people doing rough physical labor. By the end of a long shearing day, there would be a large pile of fleeces waiting, and the real work, the slow work, the indoor work, was about to begin. The sheep are shorn, the sun is still high, the pile of wool smells faintly of the outdoors, of grass and lanolin and something warm. Tomorrow, the washing begins. Raw wool is not clean. This is something worth understanding before we go any further, because the word wool tends to make people think of something soft and pleasant, and it can be, eventually. But first, it is a greasy, somewhat muddy, occasionally matted bundle of fiber that smells like the animal it came from. The lanolin, which protects the sheep's skin, coats every fiber. It is waxy and thick. If you tried to spin wool straight from the sheep without washing it first, you would end up with something heavy, sticky, and difficult to work with. The lanolin also attracts dirt, which sticks to the fibers during the year the sheep spends outdoors. Then there are other things in the fleece: bits of hay, seeds, small pieces of twig and plant matter that the sheep wandered through. Depending on the breed and the pasture, the fleece could be quite full of what is called vegetable matter, which sounds polite and is exactly what you imagine. So, washing. The process of washing raw wool is called scouring, and it had to be done carefully because wool is surprisingly delicate for something that looks so tough. The problem with washing wool is that heat and agitation, the two things you would naturally use to clean something, are exactly what causes wool to felt. Felting is when the fibers lock together permanently into a dense mat. It is irreversible. You cannot unfelt wool. Ask anyone who has put a wool jumper in the washing machine by mistake. They know. So the water had to be warm, not hot. The washing had to be gentle, not vigorous. The fleece was placed in a large trough or pot of warm water with some kind of cleaning agent. Early on, this was often stale urine, which sounds alarming, but is actually quite effective as a cleaning agent due to its alkaline content. By later periods, people used wood ash lye, water filtered through ashes, or certain plant-based soaps. The wool soaked. It was gently moved around, squeezed carefully, never scrubbed or wrung hard. Then it was lifted out, rinsed in clean water of the same temperature. Cold rinse water would shock the fibers and cause felting, and then laid out flat to dry. A freshly washed fleece spread out in the sun was a pleasant sight, white and clean and airy, smelling now of nothing much at all. It also took a long time to dry. Everything about this process took a long time. That was simply the rhythm of it. The wool is washed. The yard smells faintly of wood smoke and clean water. The fleeces are spread across low hedges and fences, drying slowly in the afternoon air. There is no hurry. Once the wool was dry, it needed to be opened up. Raw fleece, even after washing, is a compressed, tangled mass. The fibers are going in every direction. Before you can spin it into thread, you need to align those fibers so they all run in roughly the same direction. This makes them much easier to draw out into a smooth, even strand. The process of doing this was called carding or combing, and the two were slightly different techniques that produced slightly different results. Combing was the older method. You used a pair of large combs, wooden handles with long metal teeth like very aggressive hairbrushes. You loaded one comb with wool, then drew the other comb through it again and again until the fibers were parallel and all the short ones, the tangles, and any remaining vegetable matter were removed. What you were left with was a long, silky preparation called a top, which was ideal for spinning a smooth, fine thread. Combing required skill. The combs were heavy. Done wrong, you just tangled everything up again. Done well, the result was beautiful. Long, parallel fibers, almost shimmering, ready to spin. Carding came a little later and used flat paddles, the hand cards with wire teeth set into leather. You loaded one card with wool, then drew it across the other in a sweeping motion, over and over, until the fibers were opened up and loosened. What carding produced was called a rolag, a soft, airy little cylinder of fluffed fiber. Less perfectly aligned than combed wool, but faster to prepare and great for spinning a softer, slightly fuzzier kind of yarn. Different fibers needed different treatment. Long, strong wool fibers were generally combed. Shorter, softer fibers were carded. Either way, this work was done mostly by women and children. It was often called a cottage industry because it happened in cottages, in the evenings, by firelight, while people talked or listened to someone tell a story. Children could card wool while sitting still. Old people whose hands were not steady enough for spinning could still card. It was something the whole family could do together, quietly, for hours. There is something almost hypnotic about carding, the repetitive back and forth, the wool slowly loosening and puffing up, the fibers aligning little by little into something orderly. After all that effort, what you had was still not thread, it was not cloth, it was just prepared fiber waiting for the next step. But it was much, much closer. The evening is quiet. The firelight is low and warm. A pair of hands moves back and forth, drawing one card across the other, and little by little, the wool becomes soft and ready. Now we get to spinning. Spinning is the process of drawing those prepared fibers out into a thin strand and twisting them together so they hold their shape. That is all thread is, really. Fibers pulled thin and twisted. The twist is what gives it strength. The oldest tool for doing this was the drop spindle. A drop spindle is a beautifully simple device. It is just a stick with a weight at the bottom, the whirl, and a hook or notch at the top. That is it. That is the whole machine. You hold your prepared wool in one hand, either attached to a distaff, which is just a stick or post that holds the fiber, or just in your hand. You attach a little of the wool to the spindle, you give the spindle a twist, and let it drop. As it falls, spinning, the twist travels up into the fibers you are slowly drafting out, drawing thin from the main bundle. The spinning weight keeps the tension on the thread and keeps it twisting even as you add more fiber from above. When the spindle reaches the floor, you wind the thread onto it, give it another spin, and continue. That is the entire process. It sounds almost too simple to be the technology that clothed the ancient world, and yet it was. Every piece of fabric in ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, every blanket, every sail, every piece of linen or wool, all of it was made with thread spun on a drop spindle. A good spinner could do this while walking, while talking, while watching children. The hands learned the motion so thoroughly that it became unconscious, and the mind was free to go elsewhere. There is something meditative about it, apparently. The constant gentle rhythm, the thread growing slowly longer, the spindle turning. People spun for enormous amounts of time. A skilled spinner could produce perhaps a few ounces of thread in a day. A woven piece of cloth might require pounds and pounds of thread. The math is slow. It always was. The drop spindle remained in use for thousands of years and only began to be replaced, gradually, incompletely, by the spinning wheel, which came later and made things faster, but not fast in any modern sense of the word. Just faster than before. The spindle drops. It spins slowly, pulling the thread tight. The fiber feeds through the fingers, little by little, and grows into something long and even and strong. Outside, it is quiet. The evening carries on. The spinning wheel arrived in Europe sometime around the 13th or 14th century. It had come from Asia, where versions of it had existed for several centuries before that. And it changed things. Not overnight, not completely, but it changed them. The basic principle is the same as the drop spindle. Fiber is drafted and twisted into thread, but the wheel mechanizes the twist. You turn the wheel with your hand or foot, and a belt connects it to a spindle, which spins rapidly, many times for each rotation of the wheel. This made spinning significantly faster. The early spinning wheel, sometimes called the great wheel or the walking wheel, was operated standing up. The spinner would step back to draw out the thread, then step forward to wind it on. The motion was a kind of slow dance, back and forth, back and forth. Later came the treadle wheel, where a foot pedal powered the wheel, freeing both hands for the spinning itself. This was faster still, and it allowed the spinner to sit down, which, after many hours of work, was probably a welcome development. But here is the thing that often surprises people. The spinning wheel did not replace hand spinning all at once. For centuries, the two existed side by side. Different wheels suited different fibers. Some yarn was still better made on a spindle, and the wheel was expensive. Not every cottage had one. A skilled wheel spinner could produce thread several times faster than a spindle spinner, but several times faster than very slow is still slow by modern standards. A good spinner working a full day could produce perhaps a pound or two of yarn on a wheel, enough for a small section of cloth. It still took many days of spinning before there was enough thread to weave anything substantial. The sound of a spinning wheel is one of those sounds that once you know it, you can almost feel in your chest. A low, steady whir, the rhythm of the treadle, the soft hiss of the thread drawing out. It was a sound that filled cottages for hundreds of years, morning and evening, in good weather and bad. Mothers spun while their children slept. Old women spun by firelight. Young women spun because their households needed cloth, and cloth needed thread, and thread needed hours, and the hours were there. It was quiet work, mostly, and it suited quiet evenings. The wheel turns, the thread grows, the fire crackles softly, and outside it is getting dark. Now we have thread, or yarn, as it is called once it has been spun. A long, continuous strand, wound into a skein, a loose loop that keeps it from tangling and allows it to be dyed evenly. And here is where things become, quietly, quite beautiful, because raw wool yarn is a pleasant enough color, creamy white or sometimes a natural brown or gray, depending on the sheep, entirely serviceable. But for most of human history, people wanted color, bright color, soft color, rich color. And to get color, they turned to the world around them. Before synthetic dyes existed, and synthetic dyes only became available in the mid-19th century, every color in every piece of cloth came from something natural: plants, roots, bark, insects, minerals. The colors available were often beautiful, sometimes surprising, and occasionally very expensive. Woad was one of the most common dye plants in medieval Europe. It produced a range of blue shades, from pale sky blue to deep indigo. The leaves were harvested, fermented into a paste, dried into balls, and then dissolved in a dye bath. The process was foul-smelling and time-consuming, but the result was one of the most reliable blues available before imported indigo arrived from Asia. Madder root gave reds and oranges. It had to be dried and ground before use, and the color ranged from soft terracotta to deep burgundy depending on how the bath was prepared. Weld, also called dyer's rocket, gave a clear, bright yellow. Oak galls, iron-rich water, and walnut shells all gave browns and blacks. Lichens gathered from rocks could produce soft purples and pinks. And then there was cairns, a tiny insect that lived on certain oak trees, which produced one of the most brilliant reds in medieval Europe. Very expensive, very sought after. Later replaced by cochineal, another insect imported from the Americas, which gave an even more vivid crimson. Before dyeing, the yarn was usually treated with a mordant, a mineral substance like alum or iron that helped the color bond to the fiber. Without a mordant, the dye would often wash out or fade quickly. The dye pot sat on the fire, bubbling gently, and the yarn was added and slowly stirred. The color crept in, fiber by fiber. It was not a precise science. The same dye recipe made on 2 different days might give 2 slightly different shades. The water, the fire temperature, the age of the plants, all of it mattered, and none of it could be perfectly controlled. This is actually one reason why very old textiles have such beautiful, irregular color. Not because someone planned it that way, just because that is what happened. The dye pot cools. The yarn comes out in new colors, bright and wet, and hangs up to dry in the air. Tomorrow it will be ready to weave. Now, with yarn dyed and dried and wound onto bobbins, we arrive at the loom. A loom is, at its heart, a frame for holding threads under tension. That is the whole idea. You hold a set of threads stretched tight. These are called the warp threads, and then you pass another thread back and forth through them. This is the weft. Over, under, over, under. That interlocking is cloth. But before any weaving could happen, the loom had to be dressed. This meant winding the warp threads, which had to be long enough for the entire finished piece of cloth and numerous enough to give it the right width, onto the back beam of the loom, threading each one individually through small loops called heddles, through a comb-like device called the reed, and tying them off at the front. This process is called warping, and it is genuinely tedious. Not the fun kind of tedious, the kind where you lose count of which thread you are on and have to start again. A narrow piece of cloth might need 200 warp threads. A wider piece, for something like a blanket or a length of good woolen cloth, might need 500 or 600. Each thread had to go through the correct heddle in the correct order without twisting or crossing. An experienced weaver could set up a loom relatively quickly. For someone new to it, the process could take an entire day or more. The heddles are the clever part. They are what makes the pattern possible. In the simplest weave, called plain weave, the heddles simply alternate, lifting every other warp thread so the shuttle can pass through, then dropping those and lifting the others, over, under, over, under. But by using more heddles and more complex threading patterns, weavers could create twills and diamonds and chevrons and all manner of geometric patterns, all emerging from the simple logic of which threads go up and which stay down. Medieval weavers, even working with very simple looms, could produce remarkably complex cloth. The skill was not in the machine. The machine was simple wood and string. The skill was entirely in the weaver's hands and eyes and patient understanding of the pattern. The loom is dressed. The threads stretch across it, parallel and taut. Everything is ready. It is almost time to weave. The sound of a working loom is one of the more satisfying sounds you can imagine. There is the thud of the beater, a heavy wooden frame that presses each new row of weft thread firmly into place. There is the clack of the heddles rising and falling. There is the soft swish of the shuttle carrying the weft thread across and back. And underneath all of it, a kind of rhythmic creak from the loom itself, the whole wooden frame absorbing the repeated motion. Thud, clack, swish, thud, clack, swish. It could go on for hours like that. In a weaving workshop, this sound filled the room constantly. A large professional workshop might have several looms running at once. The noise was not overwhelming, but it was relentless, and after many years in the trade, weavers tended to go a bit deaf. In a cottage, one person weaving could be heard from outside the building. The process itself, once the loom was set up, was almost meditative. You fell into the rhythm. Your hands and feet learned the pattern. Feet on treadles to raise and lower the heddles, hands throwing the shuttle and pulling the beater, and after a while, you could weave without thinking about it consciously. Your body just knew. This freed the mind to wander. Weavers were apparently known for being great thinkers and conversationalists. Long hours at the loom gave the mind a lot of time to go over things. Problems could be thought through, stories could be composed, songs could be sung quietly, matching the rhythm of the loom. The cloth grew slowly. A skilled weaver could produce perhaps a yard of cloth in a day, depending on the width and the complexity of the pattern. A full length of cloth for a piece of clothing might take a week or more of solid weaving. But it grew, row by row, each pass of the shuttle adding something permanent to the structure. And when you reached the end of the warp, you cut the finished cloth free from the loom, and you had something that had not existed a week ago. Cloth. Actual cloth. Not yet finished, there were still one or two more steps, but cloth. The rhythm of the loom slows for the night. The fire is lower now, the room is quiet, and the half-finished cloth stretches across the frame, waiting for morning. When cloth came off the loom, it was not quite finished yet. Woolen cloth, in particular, needed one more important step. It needed to be fulled. Fulling is controlled felting. Remember how washing wool required care to avoid felting? The fibers locking together into a solid mat? Well, it turns out that a small amount of that locking is actually desirable in finished woolen cloth. It makes the fabric firmer, softer, more water-resistant, and durable. So after weaving, the cloth was deliberately subjected to warm water, soap, and physical beating or trampling. Yes, trampling. The original method was to put the cloth in a trough with warm water and fulling agents, urine again, or later fuller's earth, a type of absorbent clay, and then walk on it for hours, treading the cloth with your feet, working it back and forth, encouraging the fibers to bloom and bind together slightly. Fulling mills, which used water-powered wooden hammers to beat the cloth instead of human feet, appeared in Europe in the 11th or 12th century. These were a significant development. They did the work faster and with less human effort, but hand fulling continued in areas without access to mills. After fulling, the cloth was washed clean, stretched back to its correct shape on a wooden frame called a tenter. This is where we get the phrase, on tenterhooks, and left to dry under tension, which prevented it from shrinking unevenly. Once dry, the surface of the cloth might be raised with a tool made from dried teasels, the spiky seed heads of a plant that works remarkably well as a natural comb. The raised fibers were then sheared smooth with large flat blades, giving the cloth a soft, even surface. By the end of all this, the cloth that had started as a pile of greasy wool on a sheep was now something quite lovely. Soft, firm, warm, colorful if it had been dyed. Ready to be sold, cut, and sewn. Ready to become something that someone would wear. The cloth stretches on its frame in the afternoon light. It is done now, or nearly. The work is almost over. Almost. Something worth pausing on, before we go any further, is who was actually doing all of this. Because it is easy to tell this story as a series of processes: washing, carding, spinning, weaving, without thinking much about the people behind each step. The truth is, cloth production in medieval and early modern Europe was spread across an enormous number of people, mostly working from home, mostly women, mostly paid very little. The spinning alone, which we have already established was slow and constant, was done almost entirely by women and girls. A single household weaver typically needed the output of several spinners just to keep the looms supplied with yarn. This is actually where the word spinster comes from. It originally just meant a woman who spins. It later came to mean an unmarried woman because spinning was often how unmarried women supported themselves, working as spinners for other households or for merchants. Carding and combing, as we mentioned, was also cottage work, done in the evenings by the fire, fitted around everything else life required. Weaving was more often men's work, at least in the professional trade. The large horizontal treadle looms used in workshops required physical strength and long hours of dedicated concentration. But women wove too, especially in domestic settings, using smaller looms. Dyeing was a skilled trade, with its own guild and its own secrets. Dyers were often considered slightly mysterious, partly because they kept their recipes to themselves, and partly because the process involved unusual ingredients and turned their hands and clothing permanently strange colors. The whole system was deeply interconnected. A merchant would provide raw wool to a spinner, collect the spun yarn, pass it to a dyer or a weaver, collect the finished cloth, and sell it at market. Everyone in the chain was dependent on everyone else. Everyone was supposed to do their part at the pace the system required. And the pace was slow, patient, human-scaled. One pair of hands, one pile of wool, one long evening. Repeated across thousands of households, across hundreds of years. The fire is low. The work is done for tonight. Somewhere, someone is winding the day's thread onto a bobbin, and somewhere else, someone is just beginning. Once the cloth was finished and folded, it had to be sold. This happened at cloth markets, also called cloth fairs, which were a central part of economic life in medieval and early modern Europe. Towns that had the right to hold cloth markets were wealthy towns. The right itself was a privilege granted by the crown or a lord and guarded carefully. The most famous cloth market in medieval England was probably the one held at Stourbridge, near Cambridge, which for several centuries was considered one of the largest fairs in all of Europe. Merchants came from Flanders, from France, from the Italian city-states to buy English wool and English cloth. The river was full of boats. The fields outside the town filled up with temporary stalls and booths, and for several weeks each year, enormous quantities of cloth changed hands. But most cloth was not sold at great international fairs. Most of it was sold at local markets. A weaver from a village would bring their finished lengths of cloth to the nearest town on market day, set up a stall, and wait. The cloth would be measured, inspected, and argued over. Quality mattered enormously. Cloth that was poorly spun, unevenly woven, or badly fulled was worth much less, and buyers knew what they were looking at. In towns where the cloth trade was regulated by guilds, inspectors, called cloth searchers, would examine cloth for faults. Cloth that did not meet the standard could be confiscated or fined. This sounds harsh, but it protected the trade. English cloth had a reputation across Europe, and that reputation was worth defending. The buyer and seller settled on a price. Money changed hands. The cloth was folded, tied, loaded onto a cart or a horse, and carried away to become something else. A coat, a pair of breeches, a tablecloth, a set of curtains. The weaver went home with coins and started the next piece. The market square empties as evening comes. The stalls are taken down. The buyers and sellers head home, and somewhere a pile of wool is being laid out, waiting to start the whole quiet process again from the very beginning. For most of human history, everything we have described in this story was simply how cloth was made. Not a craft, not a hobby, not something unusual, just how it was done. Every home had some version of this: a distaff, a spindle, perhaps a wheel, perhaps a small loom. The tools of cloth production were ordinary household objects, as unremarkable as a cooking pot. And then, in the 18th century, something changed. It changed gradually at first, and then very quickly. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves around 1764, allowed a single spinner to work multiple spindles at once. The water frame, patented by Richard Arkwright in 1769, used water power to drive spinning machinery, producing thread faster than any human hand could manage. The power loom, developed a few years later, mechanized the weaving itself. Within a few decades, cloth that had once required the year-round labor of dozens of cottage workers could be produced in a factory by a handful of people tending machines. This changed everything. It brought cheap cloth to the world. People who had previously owned 2 sets of clothing, if they were lucky, could now afford more. Color, pattern, and variety that had once been luxuries became ordinary. But it also ended a way of life that had existed for thousands of years. The cottage spinners lost their work. The hand weavers lost theirs. Many went to work in the factories, which were louder, faster, and much less quiet than a cottage in the evening. The drop spindle did not disappear entirely. Neither did the hand loom. They continued in remote areas, in cultures that maintained traditional textile practices, in the hands of craftspeople who valued the slower way. Even today, there are people who spin by hand, who dye with plants, who weave on wooden looms, not because they have to, but because there is something about the slowness of it that still makes sense to some people. The work is the same as it always was. One fiber drawn out at a time, one thread at a time, patient, unhurried, old. The light is fading now. The cottage is quiet. Somewhere, a spinning wheel makes its gentle sound in a warm room, and the thread grows longer, and the evening settles in. And that is how it was done. There is something easy to overlook when we look at old paintings or old photographs from centuries past. Everyone in them is wearing something. That sounds obvious. Of course they are wearing something. But think about it for a moment. Every thread in every piece of clothing they are wearing was once raw fiber. It was washed and prepared and spun and perhaps dyed and woven and finished by hand, by someone. The man in the painting with his heavy wool coat, that coat represents weeks of work by several people. The woman in her woolen dress, the child in linen, all of it made slowly, patiently, by human hands. We tend to think of cloth as a given. You go to a shop, and there it is, rolls of it, every color, every texture, cheap enough that we do not think about it much. But for almost of human history, cloth was not a given. It was something you made, or something you paid dearly for, or something you were given as a significant gift. People mended their clothes carefully because new cloth cost time and money they often could not spare. They passed clothes down through generations. They unraveled worn-out garments and respun the yarn into something new. Nothing was wasted. This is not a world we will ever return to, and perhaps that is fine. The machines that made cloth cheap also made life better in many ways. But there is something worth knowing and worth remembering about where cloth came from, about the shepherd on the hill, and the shearer with his blades, and the woman by the fire with her spindle, and the weaver in his workshop, and the fuller treading cloth in a wooden trough. All of them part of the same long, slow process. All of them contributing something to that finished piece of fabric. A world wrapped in wool, made by hand, made slowly, made with care. And now the story is over. The fire is very low now. The room is warm and quiet. Let your breathing slow down. Let the images from tonight drift gently away. The sheep on the hillside, the hands carding by firelight, the steady rhythm of the loom. All of it quiet now, all of it still. Sleep well.